May I request Ms. Neetu to initiate the panel discussions? Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Collaboration. A simple 13-letter word. Or is it? Over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll try to uncover the various aspects of bank and fintech collaboration. What works? What doesn't work? What could work given the right direction? And the last part is particularly important given the changes in the fintech as well as the regulatory landscape in India. So let's get started. If you look at the fintech landscape in India itself, India is one of the most vibrant fintech ecosystems in the world. We're third largest in terms of number of fintechs and continuously growing. And not just about the number of fintechs itself. If you look at different facets of fintechs, in many places they have increasingly begun to play a much bigger role. So whether I take the area of lending, where we look at new to credit customers, actually 36%, the fintechs have a much higher share of NTC customers compared to banks. If I look at payments, and that's something that we see on a day-to-day basis, actually the market share is much higher, almost 93%. If I look at wealth, where I look at the share of active broking clients, again, fintechs have continued to play a very important role. So the idea is that this is no longer a part of the ecosystem that we can ignore, and it's very, very important and on how we define the bank and fintech collaboration going forward. But where are we actually in terms of this collaboration? And this is one of the surveys that we did earlier in the year, where we spoke to almost 100 incumbents as well as fintechs, the leadership teams in these, and we asked them, what are the challenges that you face today in terms of bank fintech collaboration? And here are some of the responses. So, low tech maturity of the incumbents, operational complexity, which continues to be a big challenge, regulatory hurdles, and this came up a lot more in the discussions going even in the recent past, and even basic things like incentives. And it's interesting to say, if you see the last quote on the right, which is that earlier it used to be about different incentives. So fintechs focusing on valuation and scale, and incumbents tracking profitability. Thankfully, over the last few months, we are starting to see more of convergence, at least on some of those areas. While we have seen some of the challenges, we also wanted to start to think about what a solution space could look like. And obviously, it's a complex problem, so there are no simple answers. But maybe we just wanted to bring some interesting learnings from across the globe. And one such example is this. So this is actually, CBNC is a community of in the US of financial services professionals. It has about 8,600 financial institutions as part of this, and it's been going on for more than 10 years. And more recently, in Jan of this year, they actually launched something called a fintech marketplace. So in this, fintechs, it's free for the professionals from the various financial institutions, and also for the vendors. The whole idea and the concept being that while innovation happens pretty quickly, awareness of that doesn't often comes with a lag. So how do we ensure that the awareness of this innovation is also disseminated a lot more quickly? And so what you see here is, some of the snapshots where they've categorized the fintechs into different segments. Incumbents can actually provide ratings of the fintechs they work with. It provides details of the products. It's almost like the way you shop for many other things. Can you shop for partnerships? I would say some concepts out there, but people have actually really implemented it. So how do we really reimagine fintech and bank collaboration in a completely new way? And we're going to talk about that with the illustrious panel that we have here today. So there are 4 questions that we're going to talk about the panel, just understanding, what are given the topic on learnings from the past, so what have been the experiences with the fintech collaboration, what kind of learnings we have seen, and what kind of imperatives that we see going forward. So maybe let me start with the first 2 questions, given many of them are related. And Deepak, you being the CDO at Kotak, you would have had a lot of experiences. Do you want to share, what have been your experiences with this collaboration, and how has that turned out?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Neetu. Maybe I think since I'm opening, some of my statements may sound to be a bit of a dampener, because you already showed that how in most categories fintechs are way ahead and banks are somewhere behind. I think there are three models that I have seen emerge in my last 6 or 7 years. Because there was a time when 2015, 2016, everybody said, oh, our fintech's going to eat banks away and our banks getting disrupted by fintech. There was truth in that as we look at that data 7 years down the line. The second was, are banks really out there to compete with fintech? Again, I think there is enough evidence that there are banks, including we at Kotak, have been able to build certain things fast and rapidly enough to build our own fintech model coming out of an incumbent bank like 811. And I think the third part is, which is where now the larger part of the discussion is, that can fintech and banks work together to collaborate and co-create? I think we have started to see a lot of that happening in last few years, be it through the set of APIs or the open banking standards that have started to come, or looking at some kind of a partnerships where not just acquiring customer, but engagement, value add, looking at more as a TSP. So there are many form factors in which I think banks have started to figure where the values are, but that's not uniform across banks. I think each bank is looking at what model works best for them. So when I look at it from Kotak's context, obviously my way of looking at fintech is very different than probably Samir would be looking at Axis, or somebody else is looking at one of the large public sector banks. My model is very simple. I want to look at the firm at Kotak to be a fintech in itself. So there are areas where if I have to concede the space of customer engagement and experience to fintech and we be the backend layer, are we going to collaborate or participate in those space? Answer is no. So we are very clear where we will not partner or participate. But if there are opportunities to co-create with an equal incentive and value alignment, both for the customer and for the firms, then definitely we look at those opportunities. So I think there are those careful now crafting of where you collaborate, where you compete, and where you co-create. I think that has started to emerge within banks.
That's very good and clear, Deepak, that you could articulate it in such a sharp manner. Sabyasachi, I would cross over to the fintech side and hear your perspectives. How have you seen this play out, and particularly as a fintech working with multiple banks, what have been your experiences?
Thanks, Neetu. So from our perspective at Perfios, I think hello. So from our perspective at Perfios, I think the journey has been phenomenal working with banks specifically. And I cannot stress less on one important aspect, which is learning. And learning with enough curation in the process. Right? So what we have seen over years is that both banks and fintechs, or rather we will call ourselves as TechFin, we have been collaborating together in terms of co-creating a lot of journeys, and it's more of a consultative approach where we have been brought in early in the journey while the journey has been discussed within the bank so that the right amount of value creation can happen. And I think it's important for any fintech to kind of not look at short-term profitability as the goal. Rather, it has to be a lot more focus on value creation, because as a product that can hold good for long term rather than a short term objective of profitability. And I think that's what has been kind of held good for us. And I think what happened from a collaboration standpoint and a learning standpoint, the banks were quite open, and our relationship has been more of a kind of receive kind of relationship, in the sense we discussed very openly, both parties in this scenario, the banks and us, about the process improvement in terms of where we can improve and build better journeys. and I think there the collaboration truly kind of tested its ground, and it was phenomenal. So I think the key experience from our perspective has been the learning and the curation of the learning during the entire process. And overall, very personal, I would say it's a win-win handshake between both banks and us. So that's what I'll leave it at.
Got it. And also having, like you said, the learning curve itself being partnered with various banks. Samir, you've also, Deepak highlighted Kotak's way that they want to be the fintech in itself. Is there a way you also think about fintech collaboration in a similar manner, in a different manner? What have been your experiences? And I know you have great inputs on learnings on, whether you grow the pie or the way you cut the pie. So would be useful to hear that.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thanks a lot for having me on the panel, and good evening to everybody here. So, so firstly, your chart said there are 7,400 fintechs, right? And so, fintech is not one entity. There is a very, very big range. And so you have, on the one hand, you have, let's say, folks like Perfios who are actually providing capabilities. And then on the other hand, you will have folks who are helping you get customers, and very different types of partnerships. And I think the two have evolved very differently as well, historically. And both, by the way, have great value, and we have to figure out how we make both happen. Our perspective on the capability side, we are very open. If the capability is good and it's at scale, it is regulatory compliant, and so on and so forth, we are happy to collaborate. We have many of these partnerships and doing very well, actually. On the customer front, our general philosophy to partnerships is that we are India's third largest private sector bank, but our market share is 5%. So 95% is out there. And if we can get access to the 95 by sharing some value, we are happy to. We are not here to lend our license. That is very, very clear to us. We are not here to lend our banking license. But if there are folks who we can work with, and jointly build something, we'll be delighted to do that. And we've been on this journey for some time, actually. We have a reasonably well-developed tech stack, open APIs, our developer portal is actually quite good. And we have a bunch of partners that we work with. The second type of partnership, I think, has gone through a significant evolution in the last 3 years. So it's moved from everybody try everything with everybody type of thing, to now folks saying, look, every partnership to succeed requires a lot of commitment. And so you can't actually just go out and, do speed dating with everyone. You have to commit to a few relationships. So that, I think, is very clear, both for us and also for fintechs. Second, I think there is I think fintechs have understood banks better, banks have understood fintechs better over the last 3 years, because till then it was just I think 3 years back, it was a little bit of a fairy tale, right? Like,
are you saying dating versus now people
yeah,
have...
exactly. Now kind of, speed dating too. It's a great analogy. So now, you kind of seen the bad side of both things, and you are coming to terms with that. And so as an example, 3 years back, there would be fintechs who would say, X we will do over my dead body, something like that, right? Like, we will just not do it, and it may be completely against regulations, but they will just kind of say, no conversation until you can do this. That has mellowed down quite dramatically. We, on the other side, we would say that something we will do over our dead bodies, and kind of that has changed. So I think the relationships have changed and the conversation has changed. I think there are two things that are going to my learnings that are critical now for the next, let's say, 12 to 18 months. First is regulations. I think regulations is moving very fast, and it'll continue to move fast based on whatever one can hear and see. And the regulatory mindset is to say that, look, everybody is open to come and participate. However, it has to be in the right way. Please come through the front door and not through the back door. That's kind of the regulatory positioning, right? And so that, I think, will separate the wheat from the chaff over the next 12-18 months. And so that's a very important one. Critically, from a bank perspective, more and more the onus of ensuring that compliance is done is on the bank, even for the partner. And so we have to be very thoughtful about that, and we expect our partners to be thoughtful. So that is, I will say, one. The second thing, which I think is becoming more and more important, is this pie piece, right? Which is, there is a pie, which is the profit that you make from or value that you create out of a certain piece of activity. You can expand that pie or you can split that pie. And actually, in the partnership, you end up doing both. But how this pie gets split, and what is an equation or an understanding between the bank and fintech that both benefit, and not either at the cost of the other, is going to be super critical in making this happen. And this one is not, at least it's not straightforward in my mind. It's a fairly complicated piece of conversation to have.
Yeah, very interesting. And I remember in some of the conversations that you said, as the fintechs themselves are looking at profitability, so it's almost like having a clear view that is the pie going to expand enough for me to actually make profit? And it's almost like since we came to the dating example, first time you're just jumping out there. Now you're very clear of what you want, what they want, and then how do you have a much more mature conversation in some ways. So far, we've covered quite a bit on, how things are in India, and Shankar, I wanted to bring you in at this point because, as Bank of America, you've also seen how some of this happens globally. And do you see any differences, similarities on, how some of the partnerships work, and are there any learnings that we need to think about?
Sure. Thanks, Neetu. So yeah, I would say actually quite a lot of similarities if I look at some of the partnerships that our bank has got into, whether it's in Europe or in the US. And I think the way I look at it is that you have two options. You have fintech tie-ups which are strategic, which you're planning, preparing along with the fintech, like what Samir just alluded to, spend time together. And some that happen on a tactical basis. That's because of a market development or a market change. And one recent example that I can probably reference is that I'm sure all of us must have seen that sometime around November last year, one of the largest e-commerce companies just took a call that in the UK they'll stop accepting Visa cards because of merchant discounting rates and stuff like that happened in the UK. Now, if you're a bank that's offering clearing and settlement services to the e-commerce company, you need to have alternative solutions ready and immediate. You cannot be waiting for a solution to be developed, right? So for example, we then got into a tie-up in London, in UK, with a fintech called BankEd, and now we allow customers who are purchasing on the e-commerce company to just directly debit their bank accounts. Now that was not a feature or a capability we thought would be required. We thought cards would be adequate, but there was a tactical need, a sudden change in customer behavior for which we needed an immediate solution. And it worked very efficiently for us that we could quickly turn it around and launch a capability, which of course we are now cross-selling to many other customers as well. You then have the strategic things where that is a gap or an improvement in service that you need to bring in, where you will collaborate, work in partnership with the fintech. So for example, in fraud management, something that I think all banks are focused upon, all banks want to keep looking at alternatives, avenues to improve the processing. And again, in the US, we've got a specific tie-up with certain companies which help us identify the beneficiary of the payment before the payment is executed in near real-time basis, right? So that is a strategic thing that we've worked with the fintech over, let's say, a period of time. They have understood our systems, what's required for us, what kind of information sharing can we do, what is the methodology we will do for that. So I would say not very different from India in that sense, because it is a mixed bag. It is something that I guess even global banks get, that it is something that this is the future, this is the way it needs to move forward. But I agree with Deepak that just like Kotak, most banks have a clear mandate as to what they want to do with the fintechs, right? So again, not very different from an India perspective. And globally, we are clear where we'll partner with fintechs and where we are comfortable that we know that space and that we can manage it ourselves.
Fantastic, very helpful. And I'm going to now actually switch gears to, we've looked at bank, we've looked at fintech. Let's actually come in between to the glue, which actually makes a lot of this work. Without this, everything is just two presentations. The thing that actually makes it work together is technology. And, no one better than Vishy, you yourself, to speak about how some of these collaborations have worked. You've actually seen, each one's looked at certain combinations, which is they are one side and, they are looking at many banks, or a bank is looking at many partnerships. You've seen the many to many. So what do you think has worked well, not worked well? What are the learnings that you see?
Yeah, great. And
In fact, to all the panelists, and in fact Deepak alluded to, the fundamental thing what we're really looking at is, with fintechs and banks collaborating, is primarily client centricity, right? That's the first experience you're really giving to your clients or customers. And with that, what falls, which fuels that, is innovation, right? And what fuels innovation is fundamentally technology, right? With banks and fintechs, it's the great divide which used to be there, and slowly that divide or the gap is getting narrowed day by day and year by year. And that primarily gap is getting narrowed because of technology. And what I would say is, in this era, if we're fundamentally talking about a platform economy, right? You have a fundamental platform on which you're building services, either yourself as a banker or collaborating with a fintech, using the same technology or the democratization of the technology to build those services. Could be in various forms and shapes, and I'll give you a few examples as well. So it's fundamentally the platform economy, marrying the old versus the new, and thereby modernizing the whole landscape. The second piece is some of the innovations. In fact, the Honorable Governor also spoke today morning of the CBDC as well as one such big innovation which is creeping in, and that wouldn't have happened without technology being at the forefront, right? Be it in the form of blockchain or any other form and shape. Today we see AI, which is becoming pretty much pervasive, almost in everything and any operations which we do, right? It could be in terms of giving an instant loan from a bank, which used to take probably days or weeks earlier, and now it's become instant. That's where technology is in the background. The client doesn't see that technology, but experiences that, and that becomes the glue. Or for another example of payments, or for the example lending management solutions. All of them where technology is the backbone, which really fuels it. CBDC is another example. And of course, you see a lot of other places which really come in modernizing these applications, right? From legacy to the new. How quickly, to the point what Shankar also mentioned, that how quickly can you, or to the point what Deepak said, that can we co-create with a fintech, and how quick that can be and deployed immediately, rather than the age-old era of building an app and developing it, brainstorming and testing it, UAT and all of that. Those days are gone, and that's where technology really is on that, putting this entire innovation and this collaboration on a super accelerated high, and that's where IBM and the technology providers really come.
Very interesting. And as we look at the future, because so far we've looked at experiences from a different angle. I think as we think about imperatives for the different players in the future, so we've looked at a certain maturity curve that has happened over the last few years, when partnerships happened, certain learnings happened. Now people have become clearer on what they want. People have also started to express that clarity in the relationships. Technology, of course, has helped in a way, it can be more API driven and people can have the connections much faster. But if you were to really think about the learnings from this, and if you were to accelerate the maturity going forward, are there certain imperatives that we look at from the fintech's perspective, from the bank's perspective, from a regulator? Some people say, should we just standardize a lot of these protocols? There are, players in between who are already trying to say, look, if there are, M banks and N fintechs, and, typically they would do M cross N connections, and, I can become the player in between so that it's M plus N and not M cross N. Should it be players, or should the regulator itself talk about, certain standard protocols so that the time to integrate is like, crunched by whatever, 80%. Are there certain things that you feel could be imperatives which will really help accelerate the maturity going forward? And maybe, Deepak, we can start with you and, then hear from the others.
So I would say that technology readiness is not an issue in today's context. It probably was 2-3 years back, but most banks, including like Samir said, or at Kotak, I think beyond whatever are the set of APIs that has been opened up through account aggregator, I think banks have gone and opened many more APIs. So as we speak, we have close to 390 APIs which are available on our API platform. Okay, so I think the core, and as more and more of tech modernization continues to happen within banks, we upgrade our systems, make it API ready, or moving a lot of our new infrastructure on cloud, so our ability to scale up and scale down depending on some of the partners and opportunities that we identify and pursue. I think all of that has started to happen, including the whole cloud-ready infrastructure on Kubernetes and containerizations and streaming of data. I would say 80 to 90% most banks have got that part right, at least those who are ahead of the curve, while others may be at different stages. So I don't see tech as a challenge as we speak. Having said that, I think there are 3 or 4 other areas of enablers. That is what everybody around is more concerned. One is on the whole data and privacy piece. Because as you open up, I think we all understand that the regulatory responsibility rests with a regulated entity, which in this case is bank. Also to ensure that both, even though the data privacy guidelines are yet to come, but I think banks have already started to follow a large part of it, not waiting for the regulation. So I think in terms of access to data, breach of data, what data is getting stored by a fintech or a partner in case if we do those handshake, that becomes one of the critical decision-making point when we do this. The second is largely on the security. Because as we open certain set of APIs, say payment, transfers, you want to enable certain functionalities, what if there is a breach on any of these? So while we can all harden our own environment and how this access happens, but then we start to look at ecosystem risk rather than just protecting our own 4 walls. So I think that again is one of the critical parameters. And I would say the other part is largely we touched in the earlier part is which business or business model do we see a relevance of going and partnering or co-creating or using even a technology, because a lot of fintechs, they come in to accelerate the growth for the firm. So typically we bring them as a point solution or as technology service provider. But there, whether these fintechs will continue to be in business for long becomes one of the key decision criteria, because you don't want a fintech which probably is unable to raise their next round of fund, and then you find that you have decided to build some critical component with that fintech, and then you are scouting around for an alternative very soon. So I think depending on this, each of these parameters, we have started to assign risk in criteria to see when we are looking at it, what are these criteria depending on what kind of partnership or opportunity are we pursuing, what if scenarios in each of these cases, and then how do you ensure if it's customer facing, for example, brand becomes important, what are your fiduciary responsibility becomes important. But if it's a technology service provider, it's the breach, the longevity of the technology service guy. A lot of these companies keep getting merged and acquired very often, and then you realize the acquiring company is not really committed to the business. So I think a lot of those risks are real, and we have all seen it happen in last 6 to 8 years. So I think keeping all of that in mind, constantly we keep working, and now even regulators have started asking banks to have a fintech governance framework and a policy. So it's not about some part of the bank deciding something which is in conflict with the other part of the firm. So I think as an organization, all of these things are now getting, I would say, into the granular level of operating and the governance framework apart from technology roadmap.
Got it. So it's not just about a cool shining thing anymore. There's a structure to the governance, and from a bank's perspective coming in, and I would say even the fintechs to be prepared that, these are the questions which are going to come at me, and this frankly makes logical sense. So I also need to kind of evolve towards that. Samir, what's your perspective? Have you also seen similar imperatives going forward?
Yeah. So I think before imperative, imperative has to be towards something, right? So what's the objective function? So in my mind, the objective function is that financial penetration in India is very low. Take whichever metric, cards, loans, savings accounts is now very good, but any other metric, it's quite low. And the question really is that how do we get that penetration to a level which is comparable to, let's say, some other more developed countries? And hence, how do we expand the pie, right? It is nobody's case that Axis Bank should succeed or Kotak should succeed or some fintech should succeed. That's not the objective function at all, right? So if we take that in perspective, in my mind, if I go by player, there are a few. First, with fintechs, the 2 points I mentioned, which is being clear that to be sustainable, you have to be compliant, the compliance exists for a reason, and risk management exists for a reason. And if you want to build a sustainable business, you have to be you have to work in the borders of that. And second is figuring out the business model, because this, the example that I keep giving is that if there is 100 rupees of value and that has to be split 20-80 or 50-50 or whatever else, and if that works, then fine. But if there is 100 rupees of value and you need 120 for your business model to just succeed, then that doesn't work. And that I think is a very kind of important point from a fintech perspective. From a bank perspective, I would say agility. And we often confuse speed with agility. These are two very different things. Speed is how fast you can develop something. Agility is that, are you on the job and are you making progress daily, and are you kind of pushing the problem forward. So as Deepak said, tech, I think more or less there, obviously we need to do more. But agility is not something that comes naturally to us, honest confession. And we need to find a way to be more agile. We need to also have this mindset of how do we operate in a partnership, because in this ecosystem world, as Deepak mentioned, the risk can come from anywhere. It doesn't just come from your own perimeter. It can come from outside. And you need to have this mindset of saying that, look, yes, if we have to expand the pie, we need to have the partnership. But we also need to have hence the right mechanisms to ensure we keep risk in control or whatever else in control. So those are the two on the bank side. On the regulator side, I think, by the way, I think the government and the regulator in India have created something extraordinary in terms of the public digital infrastructure. Multiple things, right? UPI, Aadhaar, account aggregator, etc., etc. But there is a long way to go. So there is a lot of this quote-unquote standardized things that they can bring to bear, which they are working on, and I'm sure given their past track record, they'll do a great job of it. But that is one imperative. The other one I would say is to create a regulatory level playing field. Today there are multiple arbitrage opportunities where Deepak or I can't do a few things which someone else can do. And those need to be evened out so that there is a level playing field and we are able to kind of compete and in the right way. So that I think is the regulatory imperative in my mind.
Sabya, what about you? You particularly, while you've heard the bank's wish list of what are the kind of things, and then also from the fintechs and regulators' perspective, what would be your wish list?
Okay, so first on the fintechs, I think Deepak and Samir already alluded to that, but let me maybe specific few stuff. I think the first is the fintechs have to become a lot more transparent. I think some of the things which banks generally are used to is very, very transparent, documented approach, a process-oriented approach, and no ambiguity. So I think that has to come from fintechs as a process, not only just process, but even the entire business model that they make has to be a lot more transparent and kind of conducive to the overall ecosystem. So that's the first imperative for fintech. The next, I think, key point which at Perfios we have been believing from day zero is the InfoSec and compliance. I think you can't be in the business and serious stuff. Banking is all about risk and managing risk. You can't avoid the compliance and InfoSec requirements that comes from the banking community. So all the fintechs needs to be prepared about it. And I think of late, the regulators are only stressing about that part. So nothing new. It was always expected. It was the factor of time. But I think people who are prepared will deal with it much maturely than unprepared. The third is, I would say I would be personally very happy if actually, and coming back to your first question of collaboration, if banks and fintech actually come out or create a product or a solution together for underserved and unserved. We do a lot of talking about it, but I really don't see a product out there which actually addresses this in true sense. Yeah, we can claim victory with some small wins, but I don't feel that there is a product out there truly which is catering to the underserved and unserved. So that's something imperative, both on a fintech and banks, but yeah, that's one. Coming back to banks, I think they have done phenomenal work, as I said, in terms of giving the learning to the fintechs. But the time has come when how do we create an environment for fintechs also to flourish and grow together is an imperative. Because is it about filling some gap, the question which I don't have an answer to, or is it actually creating a long-term value proposition for the end consumers of the banks or the fintechs? So if that question is answered, then I think truly the imperative for a bank will be taken care. And the third part on a bank is that the core systems for any bank, obviously legacy is done away with. We're seeing more microservices, API-based systems. So banks have come a long way on that. But now in terms of, and which Samir pointed out very correctly, is true change in the mindset. Because while the systems are being brought in, it's all about people in the bank, right? So everyone has to also openly accept and adopt to those, which requires a lot of change in the mindset in terms of whether it is an API-based system or a microservices-based core banking, right? So maybe the core banking completely moves to microservices because that's how everybody, the future is looking like. So are we prepared? So that's another thing. In terms of regulators, I think both regulators and if you call it the DFS have done phenomenal work. I think regulators are generally there to prevent accidents on the road when they create some regulation. We should look at it from that perspective. But it would be nice to see if, and they have done a great job in terms of innovation labs and multiple things, sandboxes. But what can be done to, as I said, promote the innovations to cater to the segments, not which are very lucrative, but to the underserved and unserved? Are we still going to operate in the same type of business model, credit model, the processes, or we break open from that and create a model which will actually address, otherwise it will be just a term financial inclusion. In what sense? Because it's all to do not just with getting, but also to extend credit. Now, is credit always the function of a particular entity or a particular entity within an ecosystem? The answer may be no. So we need to figure out, and regulators can pave the path there in terms of creating or allowing some kind of innovation which actually takes care of that concept.
Very interesting points, and I'm going to come back to one of your points earlier, which talked about bank and fintech and how they think about each other's roles, because in the North Star part, it almost makes you to think: is it that once is the role of fintech that fintechs push the boundaries and then the banks then do it and then the fintechs move to the next thing, or is it in areas which are almost cut? So we're going to come to that, but maybe quick thoughts from Shankar as well as Vishy in terms of what other imperatives that you see.
Yeah, I think majority of the points have been covered, but again, I'll bring a slightly foreign bank perspective into this discussion, from how we would look at it, right? So for us to collaborate with a fintech, the other aspect that one looks at is scale. I think Deepak alluded to it in some form about the financial status of the fintech, right? But for a bank like ours, which is across so many geographies, for me to consider opening up and working with a fintech, we would ideally like a fintech which plays in multiple markets as well, right? So that would surely be one of the preconditions for us to consider it, because while of course there will be specialized offerings, specialized products in a particular market, but for example, if I'm looking to work with a fintech for merchant acquisition, I would rather work with a fintech which is there at least in the Southeast Asian markets, right? Not just an Indian player and I then have a tie-up in India and then I've got 5 other tie-ups in each of the geographies that I'm present. So that would surely be a play, or at least a connect that we would look at when we are considering opening up or partnering with somebody. So while, as I said, all the other points were adequately covered in terms of what would be expected, but for us as a global bank, that would surely be one of the criteria as well that we would look at.
Very interesting. And even for fintechs who are looking at, let's say, partnering across markets, then actually it's not just compliance in one, but you have to think through multiple.
So some of the imperatives, more of them covered, but fundamentally what we're trying to solve is both two elements. One is especially in a perspective from an India landscape standpoint, it's scale and speed, right? FinTech do really get that speed element coming in there in terms of advancements of what they bring on the table. But scale is one of the another big imperative, because for banks of this size, be it Deepak, Kotak or Axis or any other banks in India, we're talking about scale in India. And to the point what Sabya mentioned, the unserved or underutilized people, right? I think so that's very important as well. The second piece is from a FinTech standpoint, what we're really looking at is how do you embed technologies into your own portfolio, right? How do you adopt the latest generation? Could be an AI, could be microservices architecture, could be any of those which would really come in. And from a bank's perspective, obviously, how do you modernize the legacy, right? You are still going to carry a good amount of the legacy. How do you modernize that, and how do you kind of marry that to the FinTech's new age world? That's equally important, keeping very important aspect in mind of the regulatory compliances which you need to govern, especially on security and especially on data privacy as well. Because as and when we are going to the platform economy and opening up more and more APIs, the exposure or the aperture of the cyber breaches are going to be even more enhanced, right? And that's going to be very, very critical in that sense as an imperative for privacy of the data as well as security. From a tech provider standpoint, the basic imperatives are how do you kind of look at four broad pivots. One is, it could be in the form of analytics and data of AI, and which is where as a tech provider, as IBM, what we have done with the FinTech world is recently announced something called as embedding a technology in your FinTech or in your application or whatever you develop, is embedding an AI into it. We just announced a couple of the libraries like speech to text, text to speech, natural language processing, some of that. Why do you want to build it when the tech provider is already providing it and you could embed it? So you could have a faster go-to market and collaborate much more efficiently with speed. The second is, of course, automating. And this goes without saying, we automate, and just not process automation, but actually building in intelligent automation. We have done this for one of the large private sector banks in India as well. How did we automate a lot of these APIs in there? There's some of the trade finance operations and treasury operations. That's another one. And third, of course, is security I spoke about, and fourth is modernizing the legacy. I think these four pivots around the AI, automate, secure, and modernize would be broadly the imperatives which we go at the foundation level, doing it at scale and with speed. That's what I would say.
And also for different categories of players, right? Because as Deepak highlighted initially, some banks would have already gone at and FinTechs would have already be at a much higher maturity, whereas in many you would still need to, go up that curve. So how do you bring that going forward? Maybe just moving to the last question, in the interest of time, and this is while we've, imagined to say what are the things we can do, what do you think should really be the North Star? And Samir, you started to talk about it, in terms of inclusion, or, what would really be, something which we would be proud of, that we've really got the most juice out of the, bank and FinTech collaboration, and we've been able to reach the pinnacle. Is it about that, it is truly speed dating, that, people come, meet, and, within, X amount of days we are integrated? Is it about in areas like, came up earlier, that in areas where today no one has been able to make headway individually, but together we can really solve a lot of problems which were unsolved earlier, or make significant headway in those directions? So what do you think would be the North Star of bank and FinTech collaboration? And maybe let's start this way, this time, so just to get different perspectives.
Okay, so that's just two words, I would say. Let me put it really succinctly, right? SBI YONO, right? So that's a classic example of the North Star for us in terms of really embracing, and we know SBI and the applications and the environment they are. SBI YONO really kind of transformed with its universal app and the whole plethora of services. I think that's the North Star for bank and FinTech, I would put it.
For me, I guess it would surely be speed of conversion and agility. I think we spoke about both those points. For a bank like ours, and I think Vishy alluded to it, a lot of legacy systems, a lot of legacy core banking platforms, old systems. for us to be able to pick and choose, not very different from the marketplace that you just talked about initially, to be able to pick and choose, have that ability to just get it up and running quickly would be extremely relevant. So yeah, absolutely. One day when we get there, we'll be happy about it.
I was joking with Vishy because when I was reading about the marketplace, it's actually about a community which has been existing for 10 years. And then they just decided earlier in the year to bring this marketplace. And I was thinking, FIBAC's been around for 10 years as well. This is exactly the type of community. So Vishy, why don't you just build it? And then I think we'll have a lot going. Deepak, thoughts from you?
I would say, how do we marry the speed of insurgent and scale of incumbent? So fintechs definitely bring in that speed because they are trying to break in and change and redefine a lot, but they definitely lack the scale that the banks already have. But banks obviously lack that speed to make that change happen. It would be marrying the best of both worlds, where the speed and scale can work together to redefine how we can serve the billion users who are still out of the formal financial service in India.
So I kind of go back to this objective function point, right? That at the end of the day, let's say 10 years from now, when we look back at this question, I think the only metrics that will count are how much did we expand the pie, how much did we jointly grow the universe, and what did we do differently that we were not doing earlier. So for me, the North Star would be that, as an example, let's say 30% of our incremental revenues comes from a partnership. Right? And by the way, in a way where we are kind of doing well, the partner is doing well, and we are serving a customer in a completely different way that we were not earlier doing so. So to me, that is a critical one, and I think we have to take a long-term view to this and not just a 6-8 months view.
Thanks, Amit. For me, I think two. One, I already specified in the earlier question, that is, how do we create solutions jointly for the underserved and unserved. But leaving aside that, all the four stakeholders that you mentioned, the fintechs, the banks, the regulator, technology companies, how can we work together to do away with paper irrespective of segments? As of now, do away with paper is by very select segments. You can blame it to the risk teams in the bank, the regulators, the compliance, the mindset, the people, the complexity. You can blame anyone. But the point is, are we really working towards doing away with irrespective of the segment? Now, anybody, the corporate bankers in the room would completely say, what are you saying? It's not possible. But are we really thinking? Because you were saying on the liability side, a lot more digitization has happened. If that has happened, and the tax authorities are completely moving to digital, is it not that finally your solutions or offerings will be without paper? Now, obviously, it requires regulatory blessings as well in a lot of perspective, and one such step is CBDC maybe. In a long run, it will maybe show what the true colors are. But what I'm trying to say is, the true North Star will be making or giving that experience to the end consumer which is completely seamless and frictionless, without asking for tons of documents that we today ask, just because of the simple design and the risk elements to it. Can we do?
Why not? And I'm sure when people conceptualize UPI, you could really think how this would work. And today, you go to any corner and you can pay. And I think many people in the world, and we actually studied this, feel that this is actually one of the most advanced payment systems that we've seen. So yeah, let's see, 5 years down the line, hopefully we should see some of those objectives realized. We have time for maybe one question from the audience, which we can take. Gentleman over there, do we have a mic?
Bankers, and Deepak closed it by saying, by concluding it with a marriage. From the perspective of alternate data, that fintechs are bringing in for decision making, while you spoke of, various stakeholders, regulator being one of them, And the financials are playing a very crucial role in banks' credit decisioning especially. So why is there no thought process in terms of digitizing the financials for the commercial organizations? Second would be for Sabya. While we spoke about profit sharing, is there risk sharing also being owned from the fintech perspective?
I think for the panel as a whole.
Okay, so see, on the commercial side, as I said, I mean, all the four stakeholders has to play its part. And if I understood the question correctly, is that while a lot is happening on the retail, why commercial is not seeing that kind of traction, which ideally on the digital space it should see. One, as I said, one is overall as an ecosystem, are we ready or are we aligned in terms of the risk or the policy changes that it requires to support the commercial banking on the digital front? I think a lot has happened post UPI and QR. You are seeing a lot of micro enterprises, and I was reading some report. It's crazy numbers which you see who are on QR code, right? But they are not registered under MSMEs. So can we take a look at the policy and change something which has not been thought about? So I am not sure, is it the right time right now? But definitely there should be a forum which should debate on this, which includes all the four stakeholders which Neetu mentioned. If that happens, I think we are on the right track in terms of making commercial banking truly digital as well. But it has to start from someone taking that step. As a tech fin, we are definitely trying our best to come out with more products and solutions which at least starts the journey of digitizing on the commercial side. But maybe some more consultation with the banks and regulators will help to bring it to closure. That's on the first question. The second part is, I think you said, how do we manage the profitability, right? That's what he was asking. See, as I said, profitability is a factor of value creation. Any organization, it has nothing to do with fintech or a bank or a manufacturing concern or an FMCG or anyone. If you are able to create a value for your consumers and they see value over a period, it cannot be without profitability, right? And I think a lot in the news is funding winters. It is nothing but basic principles of accounting, right? No organization can run without profitability being in place. So I think it's just stressing upon, again, that fundamentals, which is, do you have the right product, right solution, right product for your consumers so that you can run a profitable organization. So that's how I would say, and in this partnership, whether it is bank or fintech, I think it's time where both appreciates that the value that a fintech brings, and the fintechs also appreciates. And I started with the point that the curation of learning that we have seen in our own journey, it has been a journey from the banks, and Deepak is here. We started way back with Kotak. There is immense amount of learnings that we have had, and which has improved our product offerings as well. So it is both benefiting, and hence you see a lot of profitability eventually kicking in. That's what I would say.
I'll just add two bits to, I think, this. From bank side, see, when we work, banks and fintechs have very different objectives at times when they get into a partnership. Banks play quarter to quarter, banks have to look at NPAs, there are certain risks parameters that banks have to work on. So it's when the marriages are between two different set of firms with very different expectations and goalposts. The meeting point on that doesn't happen easily, right? So fintechs are in a valuation game while banks are looking at the profit. Fintechs have a risk capital, banks have a risk averse or risk management practice. I can give you many such examples within that. So the question is, are there common points which you think can still get this whole engagement working? And that's why while we were saying tech was the easier part, A lot more is about various other components, understanding the risk and regulation, what kind of capital, what kind of, you may call it FLDGs and all those models used to work. But then first loss you will guarantee, but who will eventually go and collect the money? Banks think that they have a better way of collecting the money. So I think a lot of those still, I would say, are things that can be discussed in a much smaller group. However, coming to your commercial bank piece, I would say a lot has already started to happen. Okay, I think thanks to the GST, apart from that, a lot of data today is available, and thanks to the Open Credit Network, Open already lending on the GST through GEM Sahay has started. The GST based lending will start. We were in fact the first bank to start giving the real-time credit decision and lending on Open platform. Many banks will join in a phased manner. I think the trade and cash management already is largely building a strong digital footprint. I think banks have joined hand together now to build the IBBC, which is a blockchain infrastructure company. The idea again there is to look at how you can do the not just real-time bill discounting, but supply chain finance, inventory management, paying to your vendors. And I think some of those new products will start getting created. And then the last of it, I think, which is already matured, is the whole accounting and banking reconciliation through Tally plugins, and Zoho and all has already started to bring in small businesses and mid-sized business into the fold of digital. And like Sabya was saying, thanks to the whole digital payment footprint, as that is getting